The city pulsed with a kind of restless energy that Kate had grown used to. It was a place where dreams were made and broken in equal measure, where bright lights masked the loneliness that seeped into the cracks of everyday life. She had come here with hopes of becoming an artist, someone whose work would be admired, displayed, even celebrated. Instead, she spent her days juggling part-time jobs, painting in the dim light of her cramped apartment, and caring for her mother, whose illness seemed to drain more from her each day. Her fingers were numb as she stepped onto the crowded sidewalk, tucking her scarf tighter around her neck. The cold had settled deep into the city, the first whispers of winter curling through the streets. She had just finished a long shift at a small art supply store, one of 3 jobs she currently held. The pay was barely enough to cover the rent, let alone the rising medical bills, but she refused to give up. Not when her mother needed her. Kate's boots splashed through puddles as she hurried toward the subway station. The rain had started falling heavier now, turning the streets slick with reflections of neon signs. The sharp scent of wet asphalt filled the air, mingling with the distant aroma of roasted chestnuts from a street vendor. Just as she rounded the corner near the station entrance, her mind tangled with thoughts of overdue bills and the latest test results from the hospital, she collided hard into someone. The impact sent her stumbling backward, nearly losing her footing as her bag slipped from her grasp. "Are you all right?" A deep voice, smooth, controlled. Kate blinked against the rain, her pulse stuttering as she looked up. The man before her was tall, dressed in an expensive charcoal gray coat. His dark hair slightly tousled, as if the rain hadn't quite had the chance to ruin his polished look. His striking blue eyes locked onto hers, an unreadable expression flickering across his face. For a moment, she couldn't move. Something about him felt familiar. "I'm fine," she muttered, snapping herself out of it. She bent down, quickly scooping up her bag before the dampness could seep into her sketchbook. "Sorry, I wasn't looking where I was going." The man studied her for a second too long, his brow slightly furrowed. "It's all right," he said finally. "It happens." His voice carried something, a note of curiosity, maybe even hesitation. Kate felt an odd sense of awareness settle in her stomach. There was something unnerving about the way he was looking at her, as if trying to place a memory just out of reach. She adjusted the strap of her bag and stepped to the side, eager to put distance between them. But just as she turned away, he spoke again. "Wait." Kate stopped, glancing back reluctantly. "You," he hesitated. For a brief second, something flickered in his gaze. Uncertainty, curiosity, something deeper. But then it was gone, replaced by the cool, unreadable mask of a man who was used to being in control. "Never mind," he murmured, shaking his head slightly. Kate frowned but didn't press further. She had no time for cryptic strangers. Without another word, she turned and disappeared into the crowd, rain soaking through the fabric of her coat as she descended into the subway station. She didn't look back. Jared stood motionless as the crowd swallowed her, the echo of her voice still lingering in his mind. "It's her." His fingers twitched at his sides. It had been years since he had last seen those eyes. At first, he had dismissed it as a trick of the mind, a moment of misplaced familiarity brought on by exhaustion or the way the rain blurred everything into nostalgia. But the second she looked up at him, something inside him shifted. He knew those eyes. The same fire. The same defiance. The same flicker of something too raw, too real. "Kate." He exhaled, dragging a hand through his hair. This city was full of ghosts, but this was the first one that had looked back at him. And for the first time in years, Jared felt something crack open inside him, a feeling he had long since buried beneath the weight of business meetings, investment deals, and the carefully curated image of a man who had everything under control. He had spent so long convincing himself that the past didn't matter, that she didn't matter. But now she was here, and she had looked at him as if he were nothing more than a stranger. Jared let out a breath, shoving his hands into his coat pockets. The city hummed around him, the rain painting everything in soft streaks of light, but he barely noticed. There was no mistaking it. It was her. And this time, he wasn't going to let her disappear. Kate arrived home an hour later, exhausted and soaked through. The apartment was small, the walls covered in peeling paint, but it was home. She shrugged off her damp coat, setting her bag down carefully before heading toward the small recliner where her mother sat, wrapped in an old blanket. "Hey, Mom," she said softly, brushing damp strands of hair from her face. Her mother stirred, offering a tired smile. "You're home late." Kate crouched beside her, adjusting the blanket around her frail shoulders. "Had to cover for someone at the store." Her mother gave her a knowing look. "That's code for I worked too much again, isn't it?" Kate forced a small smile. "Maybe." Her mother reached out, squeezing her hand. "You need to take care of yourself, too." "I know," Kate lied. She stood, moving toward the tiny kitchen to make tea. As the kettle whistled, her thoughts drifted back to the man from earlier. The way he had looked at her, like he had known her, like he had seen something in her that even she had forgotten. She shook the thought away. It didn't matter. People like him, men in tailored coats with eyes like winter storms, didn't belong in her world. And she didn't belong in his. But even as she lay in bed that night, staring at the cracked ceiling, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had just shifted. That maybe, just maybe, she had collided with more than just a stranger. Kate barely made it through the rest of her shift at the Ember Gallery. Her hands trembled as she stacked empty wine glasses from the evening event, her mind spinning with everything that had just happened. Jared Hayes was back in her life. And he wasn't leaving. The worst part? He wasn't the boy she remembered. The Jared she once knew had been reckless but kind, always making grand promises about the future they would share. But this man, the polished billionaire standing in the middle of her world, was dangerous in an entirely new way. He had the power to make her feel again. And she couldn't afford that. As soon as her shift ended, Kate pulled her coat tight and hurried into the cold night, hoping that the sharp wind would clear her head. But just as she stepped onto the sidewalk, a sleek black car pulled up beside her. The tinted window rolled down. "Need a ride?" Kate froze. Jared's voice was smooth, confident, just like it had been earlier. But this time there was something else beneath it. Something that felt personal. She exhaled sharply. "You really don't know how to take a hint, do you?" He tilted his head, amused. "I do. I just choose to ignore them." Kate let out a humorless laugh. "Well, in that case, let me be clearer, I don't want anything to do with you." Jared leaned slightly against the car door, studying her. "Why?" "Because you hate me." Her stomach twisted. If only it were that simple. "I don't hate you," she admitted. I don't trust you." A flicker of something passed over his face. "Because I left?" Kate clenched her jaw. "Because you forgot." Silence. Jared's grip on the steering wheel tightened. "Kate, you have no idea what happened after I left." "I didn't." "Save it," she cut in. "You don't get to rewrite history just because it's convenient now." She turned to walk away, but his voice stopped her in her tracks. "I looked for you." Kate stilled. The city noise buzzed around them, the distant honk of a taxi, the chatter of late-night pedestrians, but all she could hear was the pounding of her own heart. She turned slowly. "What did you say?" Jared exhaled, his expression unreadable. "I looked for you, Kate. For years." A lump formed in her throat, but she forced herself to hold his gaze. "Then why didn't you find me?" He hesitated, and for the first time she saw something raw in his expression. "I didn't know where to start," he admitted. "When we left, my father made sure there was nothing left of our old life. No addresses, no connections. He cut everything off." Kate's fingers curled into fists. "And you just let him?" Jared exhaled. "I was 15. I didn't have a choice." Her chest tightened. 15. The same age she was when she realized he was never coming back. She wanted to be angry. Wanted to stay angry. But the truth was, some part of her had always wondered, what if he hadn't left by choice? She swallowed hard, looking away. "That doesn't change anything, doesn't it?" Jared asked quietly. She hated that his voice still had the power to shake her. Kate took a step back. "This conversation is over." Before he could say anything else, she turned and walked away, leaving him behind. But for the first time since their reunion, doubt crept into her carefully built walls. Because if he had looked for her, if he had truly wanted to find her, then maybe, just maybe, the story she had told herself all these years wasn't the whole truth. Jared leaned back in his seat, watching Kate disappear into the night. He clenched his jaw, gripping the steering wheel. She didn't believe him. And why should she? To her, he was just another man with too much money and a convenient excuse. But he remembered her. He remembered the way she used to draw on the sidewalk with broken chalk, how she'd whisper about the murals she wanted to paint on city walls. He remembered how she believed in him back when he was just a reckless boy with nothing to his name. And he had lost her. Now he had one chance to make things right. One chance to prove that he hadn't forgotten her. And he wasn't going to waste it. 2 days later, Kate arrived at the Ember Gallery to find a note waiting for her at the front desk. She frowned, hesitantly opening the envelope. Inside was a simple piece of paper. Come to 162 West Haven Street. Midnight. J. Kate's pulse quickened. She should ignore it. She wanted to ignore it. But something about the address nagged at her. West Haven Street. Why did that sound so familiar? Her heart pounded as she folded the note. She should walk away. But she already knew she wouldn't. Because some ghosts refused to stay buried. Kate spent the rest of the day pretending she wasn't going. She threw herself into work, rearranging gallery displays, nodding along to Olivia's instructions without actually hearing them. She convinced herself that whatever Jared had to say, it didn't matter. That she had moved on. But at 11:45 p.m. she found herself standing at the entrance of 162 West Haven Street, her breath visible in the cold air. The building loomed in front of her, its brick exterior worn with time. It looked abandoned, yet something about it stirred a deep sense of familiarity in her chest. Her fingers tightened around the note Jared had left. Why here? Before she could second-guess herself, she pushed open the door. The hinges groaned in protest. And then she saw it. The walls. Covered in paintings. Murals, sketches, unfinished portraits. And at the very center of the room, a single canvas with her name written on it. Her breath caught. She stepped closer, her fingertips trembling as she traced the edge of the frame. The painting was old. The colors faded with time. But she recognized it instantly, because she had painted it. Years ago, back when she was a girl with nothing but dreams and broken crayons. You remember this place, don't you? She turned sharply. Jared stood in the doorway, watching her carefully. Kate swallowed, forcing herself to stay calm. What is this? His gaze didn't waver. It's ours. A chill ran down her spine. You don't get to say that, she whispered. Not after all this time. Jared exhaled, stepping further inside. I didn't choose to leave, Kate, but I came back, and I found this place. Our place. Her chest ached, because she did remember. She remembered everything. The air inside 162 West Haven Street was thick with the scent of aged wood and forgotten memories. The dim light from a single flickering bulb cast long shadows over the faded murals stretching across the brick walls. Kate stood frozen, her eyes locked on the painting before her. Her painting. She had forgotten about this place. Or, at least, she had forced herself to forget. Once, a lifetime ago, this had been their hideout, an old, abandoned building tucked between the city streets where no one would bother looking. They had spent hours here, sketching on the walls, dreaming up impossible futures. A girl who wanted to paint the world. A boy who swore he would never leave her behind. She swallowed hard, pushing down the ache in her chest. You kept it, she murmured, running her fingertips along the frame. The canvas was old, but intact. Her brushstrokes, messy and unpolished, still carried the same raw, untamed energy. Jared took a slow step forward. I found it a year ago. Kate turned, startled. What? I was looking for something familiar. Something real, he admitted, his voice lower now. And I found this place. Her throat tightened. You don't get to do this, she whispered, shaking her head. You don't get to bring me here like it means something When what? Jared interrupted, stepping closer. When you've spent years convincing yourself that I didn't care? Kate's heart pounded. Because I did, Kate, he said, voice rough. I cared more than you ever knew. She exhaled sharply, fighting against the wave of emotions crashing over her. Then why did you leave? Jared ran a hand through his hair, frustration flickering across his face. You think I had a choice? You always had a choice. Kate shot back. You could have called. You could have written. I did. Silence. Her breath hitched. No, you didn't. Jared's jaw tensed. He pulled something from his coat pocket and held it out. A stack of old, worn letters. Kate blinked, her fingers trembling as she hesitated before taking them. The paper was yellowed at the edges, creased from years of being folded and unfolded. Her name was on every single one. She flipped through them, her stomach twisting. They were addressed to her old house, the one her mother had lost after medical bills piled up. She swallowed hard. I never got these. Jared let out a sharp breath, raking a hand through his hair. I wrote to you, Kate. I called. I searched. And by the time I found out where you had gone, you had already disappeared. Kate felt the world tilt beneath her feet. How many times had she convinced herself that she had been nothing more than a forgotten piece of his past? How many years had she spent hating him for something that hadn't even been his fault? Jared's voice was quieter now. I never stopped looking for you. She pressed her lips together, her pulse hammering. Then why didn't you say something when you saw me at the gallery? Jared hesitated. I wasn't sure if you'd want me to, he admitted. Kate inhaled sharply. So you were afraid. A muscle flickered in his jaw. Yeah. She let out a bitter laugh. Jared Hayes, billionaire investor, afraid of me? Terrified, he corrected. Kate froze. Jared took a step closer, his blue eyes dark with something unreadable. I knew the moment you looked at me that you still hated me. And I thought, if I told you who I was, if I reminded you of everything we used to be, you'd walk away. Her stomach twisted. She had walked away, twice, and yet here she was, standing in a place filled with ghosts. Jared let out a shaky breath. I didn't want to lose you again. Kate's fingers curled around the letters. You already had. His expression flickered. Just for a second, just enough for her to see the pain he had been carrying. And for the first time, she believed him. She believed that maybe, just maybe, she hadn't been the only one left behind. A long silence stretched between them. Jared's voice broke through it first. I want to make this right, Kate. She let out a quiet breath. You can't fix the past. But maybe I can fix this. Her gaze lifted to his, uncertainty gnawing at her edges. And how do you plan to do that? Jared hesitated. Then, without breaking eye contact, he reached into his pocket once more and handed her a small key. Kate frowned. What is this? A studio, he said. A space for you. To paint. To create. Her stomach flipped. No. It's not a gift, he cut in. It's a deal. Kate narrowed her eyes. What kind of deal? You work there for 3 months, Jared said. No obligations. No strings. Just you and your art. Kate's fingers tightened around the key. Everything inside her screamed no. She didn't want to owe him anything. Didn't want to fall back into something she had spent years trying to forget. But a small, traitorous part of her whispered yes. Because despite everything, despite all the pain and unanswered questions, Jared Hayes had given her something no one else had. A chance. And for the first time in a long time, she wasn't sure if she was strong enough to walk away from it. Kate sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the small silver key in her palm. Felt heavier than it should have. A chance. That's what Jared had called it. But a chance at what exactly? She turned the key over between her fingers, her thoughts tangled in contradictions. She had spent years trying to move forward, to let go of everything she had lost. And yet, the past had found her anyway. Jared had found her. She should have said no. She still could say no. And yet, her gaze flickered to the cracked ceiling, where water stains formed uneven patterns above her head. The walls of her apartment were thin, the heater barely worked, and no matter how many extra shifts she picked up, it was never enough. Her mother's medical bills piled up faster than she could handle. The dream she once had, the dream of painting something that mattered, felt more like a distant fantasy than something real. Jared was offering her an opportunity. No, she reminded herself. A deal. And if there was one thing she had learned about life, it was that deals always came with a price. Still, the next morning, she found herself standing outside a sleek loft space in downtown Manhattan, the key burning a hole in her coat pocket. The building was modern, the kind of place that screamed money, but when she stepped inside, something strange happened. It didn't feel like a trap. It didn't feel like a bribe. Felt like possibility. The space was huge. High ceilings, massive windows that spilled golden sunlight onto an open concept floor. The air smelled like fresh paint and wood, and every corner of the room was filled with canvases, brushes, unfinished works waiting to be born. Kate ran her fingers over a nearby work table, her chest tightening. She could see herself here, creating, breathing, being the artist she had always wanted to be. But that terrified her more than anything. Because what if she failed? Not what you expected? She turned sharply. Jared stood in the doorway, hands in his coat pockets, watching her carefully. She swallowed. It's more than I expected. His lips curved slightly. I take that as a good thing? She looked away. I don't know yet. Jared nodded as if he had anticipated that answer. He stepped inside, his presence too much in the quiet space. I told you, he said, his voice softer now. No strings. No expectations. Just you and your art. Kate exhaled. And in return? Jared hesitated. I just want to see what you can do. Her stomach twisted. Because she didn't know if she was ready for that. For him to see her in that way. To remember the girl she had been before life had broken her down. She set the key on the table, her fingers brushing the cool surface. I'll think about it, she murmured. Jared studied her for a long moment, something unreadable in his expression. Then he nodded. Take your time, Kate. And then he was gone, leaving her alone with the thing that scared her the most. Hope. The first week, she barely touched the canvases. She wandered the space, reorganizing supplies, sketching half-heartedly in a notebook, telling herself that she wasn't avoiding the work, just getting comfortable. The second week, she started mixing colors. She spent hours staring at blank canvases, waiting for something to ignite, but nothing came. By the third week, frustration set in. She had dreamed of this, of a space like this, of the time to create, of the chance to prove to herself that she was still capable, and now that it was in front of her, she was paralyzed. It had been years since she had painted something just for herself. Years since she had let herself believe that she still had something to say. And she hated that Jared was the one who had made her face it. One afternoon, as she sat on the floor, staring at a half-finished piece, she heard footsteps behind her. She didn't have to turn around to know who it was. You're hovering, she muttered. Jared smirked. You're avoiding. Kate sighed, running a hand through her hair. It's not that simple. Isn't it? He asked. You've spent your whole life wanting to paint. Now you finally can. So what's stopping you? She exhaled sharply. I don't know, Jared. But that was a lie. She did know. She was afraid. Afraid that her art wouldn't be good enough. Afraid that the thing she had built her identity around would turn out to be nothing. Jared crouched beside her, his presence warm despite the cool distance between them. You used to paint like the world was on fire, he said quietly. Like you couldn't hold it in. Kate swallowed. That was a long time ago. So? She shook her head. I'm not that person anymore. Jared was silent for a moment. Then he picked up a brush from the table, turning it over in his fingers before holding it out to her. Then show me who you are now. Kate's chest tightened. She should have pushed him away. Should have reminded him that this wasn't about him. But instead, she reached for the brush. And for the first time in years, she let herself paint. The first piece was messy. The second was worse. By the third, she stopped caring. And by the 10th, she felt something inside her shift. She painted memories, the streets she grew up on, the faces she had lost, the girl she used to be. She painted rage and longing and loneliness and hope, colors bleeding together in ways she couldn't quite explain. And through it all, Jared was there. Watching. Waiting. Never pushing, never demanding, just being there in the quiet moments when she thought she had forgotten how to breathe. And that was almost worse. Because it meant that, against all odds, he still knew her. And she wasn't sure if she could handle that. Not when she was starting to realize that maybe, just maybe she had never stopped knowing him either. Kate never expected painting to feel like this again. For years, it had been nothing more than a distant ache, a reminder of who she used to be before life had chipped away at her edges. But now, standing in front of a massive canvas, paint smeared across her hands, her heartbeat steady with focus, she felt alive. She had forgotten what that was like. Jared had given her this whether she wanted to admit it or not. He never hovered too close, never asked for more than she could give. He simply existed in the periphery of her world, watching, waiting, letting her figure it out on her own. And somehow that made it worse. Because it meant he understood her, even after all these years. And she wasn't sure if she could handle that. The first time she showed him one of her paintings, she expected him to analyze it, to break it down like a businessman, to find the value in it rather than the meaning. But he didn't. He just looked. For a long time. Finally he said, "It's beautiful." And somehow that meant more than any gallery approval ever could. Weeks passed. The pieces stacked up, each one louder, bolder, filled with color and chaos and feeling. And then, one night, everything shattered. Kate was in the studio, finishing a piece, when she heard Jared's voice, low and tense, from the other room. "I don't care what the board says," he snapped into his phone. "That building is off limits. Find another location." A pause. Kate wiped her hands on a cloth, stepping closer, curiosity tightening in her chest. "Because I said so," Jared bit out. "I don't need to justify it." Another pause. Then quieter, "I owe it to someone." Kate frowned. "Yes, I'm sure," Jared continued, his voice strained. "I already took too much from her family once." Her breath caught. She stepped into the doorway. "What did you just say?" Jared stiffened. He turned slowly, the phone still in his hand, his expression carefully blank. "Kate." She held up a hand, her heart hammering. "What do you mean, you took too much from my family?" Silence. And then, realization slammed into her like a freight train. The medical bills. The foreclosure on their home. The life her mother had lost trying to keep everything together. It had happened after her father's small art supply store went under. The store he had built from nothing. The store that had been swallowed up by a corporate takeover. By Hayes Enterprises. Kate staggered back. No, she whispered. Jared's jaw tightened. Kate, I didn't know. Not until recently. Her chest felt too tight. But you did know. And you didn't tell me. Jared took a step forward. I was going to. When? After I had convinced myself that maybe you weren't the person I thought you were. Her voice cracked. Kate, was this why you helped me? She demanded, her voice shaking. Why you gave me the studio? Was this just guilt money? His eyes darkened. No. It was never about that. She let out a sharp breath. Then why? Jared hesitated. And in that hesitation she saw everything. The guilt. The regret. The fear of losing her all over again. Her stomach twisted. She shook her head. I can't do this. She turned away, grabbing her coat, but his voice stopped her cold. You told me once that you didn't hate me, Jared said quietly. She swallowed hard. I don't, she admitted. But I don't know if I can forgive you either. The silence between them felt unbearable. Finally, Jared nodded. His expression was unreadable, but something in his posture, something in his eyes told her that he understood. Even if it broke him. Days passed. Then weeks. Kate avoided the studio, unable to set foot in the space without thinking of him. Without thinking of what they had lost. Without thinking of what they could have been. She told herself it was for the best. That Jared Hayes had been a chapter of her past, not a part of her future. But when she sat in her apartment, staring at blank walls and empty canvases, she realized something. She had been angry. But not painting hurt more than losing him did. And that was how she knew. She had to face it. Not for him. For her. The gallery was crowded the night of her first showcase. People whispered, pointing at her pieces, murmuring about the raw emotion in them. About the fire and chaos and love tangled in every brushstroke. And Kate let them. She let them see her. Because she had spent too many years hiding. She turned toward the entrance, scanning the room, but he wasn't there. Her chest tightened. But she had known, deep down, that he wouldn't come. That he was giving her the space to decide for herself. And somehow that made her decision clearer. She found him standing on the balcony of his penthouse overlooking the city. Jared turned when he heard her, surprise flashing across his face. Kate exhaled. I saw the article. A small smirk. Which one? The one about you pulling your company out of small business acquisitions. Jared was quiet for a moment. Then softly. It wasn't just about you, Kate. It was the right thing to do. Something unwound in her chest. She took a slow step forward. I don't forgive you, she admitted. Jared nodded, his gaze steady. I know. But I also know that I don't want to lose you again. The wind curled between them. And then, before she could talk herself out of it, she reached for him. Jared's breath hitched. Then he pulled her closer. And when he kissed her, it tasted like goodbyes that never should have happened. Like second chances they never thought they'd get. Like home. Months later, Bennett Gallery opened its doors. Kate stood outside, staring at the name on the window. Her name. Her mother, a healthier now, smiling, stood beside her. And at her side, watching her with the same quiet intensity as always, was Jared. Ready? He murmured. Kate inhaled. Then, finally, yeah. And when she stepped inside, she knew. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning.